Doran Voss had killed more people than he cared to count. He wasn't proud of it. Wasn't ashamed either. He did his job. He followed orders. That was the only way to survive in the Terran military. Obedience, precision, ruthlessness. So, why the hell was he hesitating now? The reinforced glass of the containment cell was thick, strong enough to withstand a plasma detonation. But somehow, it still felt fragile under the weight of the alien woman's gaze. Valeth. The reports painted her as a nightmare given form. The scourge of the Zyri, a one-woman extinction event. A biological weapon designed for destruction. The most dangerous being in the galaxy. Doran had expected a monster. What he saw instead was something far more unsettling. She was sitting on the cold metal floor, hands bound behind her back with high-voltage restraints. Too calm, too controlled. Her long, jet-black hair cascaded down her back in wild, tangled waves, framing sharp cheekbones and a strong jawline. Her skin, deep violet, smooth like polished obsidian, was marked with old battle scars, faint against the eerie glow of the containment cell's red lights. And her eyes, bright, piercing silver, were watching him, unblinking, amused. This was a woman who had faced death before, many times, and every time she had walked away. The high-ranking officers had briefed him before the mission. They had spoken of her in hushed tones, with the kind of fear Doran had only ever seen reserved for unstoppable forces. She wiped out an entire Zyri war fleet by herself. She killed Terran operatives with her bare hands. She escaped every prison designed to hold her. Not this one, Doran thought, gripping his sidearm. Not this time. And yet, the longer he looked at her, the more something felt wrong. She wasn't struggling, wasn't trying to escape, wasn't raging against the bars like the uncontrollable beast they had described. She was waiting. For what? For him? The silence stretched between them. Then finally she spoke. So, Valeth said, her voice smooth as silk, yet edged with steel. You're the one they sent to kill me. Not a question, a statement. Doran didn't respond. He let the cold weight of his presence answer for him. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. I expected someone taller. Doran's fingers twitched against his gun. She was mocking him, a prisoner in chains, awaiting execution, and she was mocking him. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his boots echoing against the steel floor. And I expected a monster. She smirked. Disappointed? His jaw clenched. Not yet. He keyed in the access code. The containment door hissed open. The moment he stepped inside, the air shifted. The room felt smaller, heavier. He had been in countless battlefields, faced down countless enemies, but something about her presence was different. It wasn't just her reputation. It wasn't just her strength. It was the way she looked at him. Not as a man with a gun, not as her executioner, but as something else entirely. Something unworthy. You don't hesitate, do you? She murmured. Doran narrowed his eyes. What? She leaned forward just slightly, just enough to make him feel like he had already lost something. Men like you. Killers. Executioners. You don't hesitate. He stepped closer, looming over her. I don't. Then pull the trigger. The challenge hung in the air between them. Doran stared down at her. This was the moment. All it would take was one shot. One press of the trigger, and she would be nothing but a body cooling on the floor. 1 second, and the most dangerous woman in the galaxy would be gone. So, why wasn't he moving? Valeth watched him, her silver eyes seeing too much. Thought so, she whispered. Doran gritted his teeth, grabbed her by the collar, and yanked her to her feet. She barely reacted, only tilting her head as if studying him. He should have seen fear. He should have seen defeat. Instead, she looked at him like she already knew how this would end. You don't know what I am, she said softly. I know exactly what you are. His voice was firm, steady. He needed it to be. But she only smiled. Do you? Doran held her gaze, and for the first time, he felt uncertainty creeping in. Because the truth was, no, he didn't. And that scared him more than anything. The alarm screamed through the ship like dying metal. Doran Voss barely had time to react before the impact hit. A direct strike. The entire vessel lurched sideways, sending a tremor through the deck beneath his feet. The red emergency lights flickered to life, casting jagged shadows against the walls. They were under attack. He grabbed the intercom. Status report. The voice that crackled back was strained with panic. Captain, we've got incoming. Zyri warship, Class 4 destroyer. They bypassed the outer defenses. Plasma torpedoes inbound. Doran swore under his breath. Of course, it was the Zyri. They had come for her. His pulse hammered as he turned on his heel, heading straight for the containment level. Valeth. He had captured the most dangerous prisoner in the galaxy barely a day ago, and already, the universe was tearing itself apart to take her back. As he sprinted down the corridor, the ship took another brutal hit, the impact rattling through his bones. The overhead lights burst, sparks showering the halls. The Zyri weren't here to negotiate. They were here to kill, and they'd destroy this entire ship to do it. A cage monster. By the time Doran reached the containment wing, the security detail was dead. Bodies lay sprawled across the floor, scorched from plasma fire. The automated turrets had been melted into slag. And in the center of the chaos, standing amidst the wreckage, was her. Valeth. She was still cuffed, but that hardly seemed to matter. 3 dead soldiers surrounded her, their weapons untouched. Doran barely slowed as he lifted his gun. What the hell did you do? She turned to him, her silver eyes glinting beneath the red emergency lights. I defended myself. You're still restrained. She smirked. You think I need my hands to kill? That sent a cold chill down his spine. Doran's grip on his weapon tightened. The Zyri are here for you. If I let them take you, this fight is over. Her expression darkened, amusement flickering out like a dying ember. They're not here to take me, she said. They're here to erase me. A shuddering explosion rocked the hull, cutting off any response he might have given. The walls groaned, metal bending under the force of another direct hit. The ship wouldn't last much longer. Valeth tilted her head, watching him. Make your choice, executioner. Doran's gut twisted. She was the mission, but at this moment, with the Zyri tearing his ship apart, he realized they were the bigger threat. His fingers moved before his mind caught up. He disabled her restraints. The cuffs fell to the floor with a sharp clang. She flexed her fingers, rolling her wrists as she stared at him. Not running, not attacking. Doran leveled his gun at her chest. Try anything, and I'll put you down. She smiled. You're starting to sound convincing. Then she turned, grabbed a rifle from one of the fallen soldiers, and moved like a damn hurricane. They fought side by side. Doran barely had time to process what was happening before Valeth was already tearing through the Zyri boarding party like a force of nature. She was too fast, a blur of violet and black, moving like she anticipated every attack before it came. She ducked under incoming fire, spun around a Zyri soldier, and snapped his neck with a single motion. Doran had seen elite warriors before. He had fought them, but Valeth was something else entirely. She wasn't just fast. She was precise. Every movement was deliberate. No wasted effort, no hesitation. She weaved through the chaos, dismantling the enemy like she had been born to do it. And maybe she had. Doran cut down 2 soldiers flanking them, pivoting to cover her. You fight like you've done this 1,000 times. Valeth dodged a plasma bolt by a hair's breadth, her silver eyes flashing in the dark. I have. She lunged at another soldier, claws extending from her fingertips. Not weapons. Not implants. Part of her. The claws sliced through armor like paper. Doran didn't have time to process that. He just kept shooting, covering her as she carved through the enemy forces with terrifying efficiency. How many are there? He demanded. Valeth ducked behind cover beside him, her breathing steady despite the battle raging around them. Too many. The ship won't hold much longer. Doran swore. His men were dead. The Zyri outnumbered them. The only option was to escape. He turned to Valeth. We need to get to the escape pods. Her gaze flicked to him, unreadable. Then she nodded. For the first time, she was trusting him too. The corridors were falling apart as they ran. Fires burned along the walls, oxygen hissing from shattered vents. The deck shook violently, metal screaming as explosions ripped through the hull. The escape pod bay was within reach, just a few meters away. Then the ceiling collapsed. Doran barely had time to react before a shockwave hurled him backward. He crashed against the floor, pain flaring through his ribs. Smoke and debris filled the air. His vision blurred. Movement. A shadow. Valeth. She was suddenly above him, grabbing his arm, hauling him to his feet with strength that shouldn't be possible. You're not dying yet, executioner. She dragged him forward, through the wreckage, through the fire, until the escape pod. Doran stumbled inside, slamming his fist against the emergency controls. The hatch sealed behind them just as the ship tore apart. The force of the explosion sent them hurtling into space. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing, the quiet hum of the pod systems. Then Doran exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to his bruised ribs. That was insane, he muttered. Valeth leaned back against the wall, arms crossed. She was watching him again, assessing. You saved me. Doran glanced at her. He had. For all his orders, for all his training, he had let her live. He ran a hand down his face, exhaustion creeping in. Don't make me regret it. Valeth smirked. Too late. The stars stretched out around them, infinite and silent. The executioner and the most dangerous woman in the galaxy. And neither of them had any idea what came next. The escape pod drifted through the vast emptiness of space, its hull scorched, its engines barely functioning. Inside, the dim emergency lights flickered, casting eerie shadows against the metallic walls. Doran Voss exhaled slowly, trying to steady his breathing. Bruised ribs, possible concussion, minor burns, but alive. That was more than he could say for the rest of his crew. His hands curled into fists at the thought. Across from him, Valeth sat against the opposite bulkhead, arms crossed, silver eyes unblinking as she studied him. She looked far too calm for someone who had just survived a near-total annihilation. You're quiet, she murmured. Doran didn't look at her. Thinking. Careful. Too much of that might be dangerous. He shot her a glare. And you're relaxed for someone the entire galaxy wants dead. Her lips quirked into the barest smirk. I don't die that easily. Doran clenched his jaw. That much he was beginning to believe. The pod's control panel beeped weakly, warning lights flashing. Life support levels dropping. Air filtration failing. The damage from the battle was worse than he had hoped. He ran a quick diagnostic, his fingers moving over the cracked interface. Oxygen reserves. 30 minutes remaining. Doran swore under his breath. Valeth's gaze flicked to the console. Well, that's inconvenient. More than inconvenient, he muttered. If we don't land somewhere soon, we suffocate. She leaned back, unbothered. Then, find us a planet, executioner. Doran gritted his teeth, but didn't argue. He brought up the star map, scanning for habitable locations. Drask 5. Uninhabited. Barely livable. Thin atmosphere, but breathable for short periods. A wasteland, but better than dying in here. Found us a rock, he said, locking in the coordinates. Buckle up. Valeth didn't move. You think I need restraints? Doran ignored her. She'd survive a crash even without them. He wasn't so sure about himself. He engaged the thrusters, and the pod shuddered violently as it angled toward the planet's surface. The descent was brutal. The pod burned through the upper atmosphere, flames licking at its hull. Alarms blared, metal groaned, and Doran gripped the controls with white-knuckled intensity. Valeth, meanwhile, looked bored. Then impact. The pod slammed into the planet's surface, skidding across jagged terrain before finally coming to a violent, grinding halt. Dust and smoke filled the air. For a moment, Doran didn't move. Pain flared through his ribs, but nothing felt broken. Then a voice. I've had rougher landings. Doran groaned. Shut up. The hatch hissed open, releasing a gust of stale air. Drask 5 was a wasteland. The sky was a dull gray, the air thick with dust carried by sluggish winds. Jagged rock formations loomed in the distance, casting long, eerie shadows. The temperature was dropping fast. It would be freezing soon. Doran scanned the horizon. No immediate threats. No sign of life. Just emptiness. Valeth stepped out beside him, rolling her shoulders as she took in the desolation. Lovely place. You always take your prisoners to such charming locations. Not a prisoner anymore, he muttered. At least not for now. She glanced at him. How generous of you. He didn't respond. He was too busy calculating their next move. Shelter first, then fire, then a plan. He turned back to the wreckage, salvaging what he could. Burnt metal, torn fabric, anything useful. Valeth, surprisingly, didn't just stand around. She crouched near a pile of debris, rubbing her hands together. A faint glow pulsed from her palms, not fire, but heat. Within seconds, the dry, brittle vegetation at her feet ignited. Doran stared. She looked up. What? You could have done that the whole time? She smirked. I wanted to see if you'd figure it out yourself. Doran exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Infuriating woman. They sat by the fire in silence for a while. The fire cast shifting shadows against Valeth's face, the sharp angles of her jaw, the glint of her silver eyes, the faint scars etched into her violet skin. Doran found himself studying her again, not just as a soldier, not just as an enemy, as a person. She must have felt his gaze because she turned her head slightly. You never asked why the Terrans wanted me dead. Doran didn't look away. I figured you were dangerous enough not to question it. She let out a quiet laugh, not humorless, but not entirely amused either. Dangerous, sure. But to who? You tell me. Valeth looked back at the fire, her expression unreadable. I fought the Zyra, yes. I killed their soldiers, their warlords. But not because I wanted war. I was made for it. Doran frowned. Made? She flexed her fingers, watching the firelight dance across her palms. I wasn't born. Not in the way you understand it. I was created to fight, to be their ultimate weapon. Doran remained silent. They built me to win their wars, to wipe out threats before they became threats. But they didn't expect me to think for myself, to decide that I didn't want to be their tool. Her silver eyes met his again, and for the first time, there was something raw behind them. I turned against them, and now, they'd rather see me dead than free. Doran shouldn't have cared. He should have heard that story and dismissed it as propaganda, as an excuse, as lies meant to manipulate him. But he didn't, because when she said it, he saw the truth in her face. The same way he had seen truth in his own reflection too many times before. You ever regret it? He asked quietly. Valeth tilted her head. Regret what? Everything you did before. She considered him for a long moment. Do you? Doran tensed. He hadn't expected the question to be turned on him, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't know the answer. He had been called the Butcher of Orion III, a title soaked in blood, a past he never spoke about. But maybe, just maybe, Valeth wasn't the only one haunted by what she was made to be. A gust of wind howled across the barren landscape, sending embers spiraling into the air. Valeth shifted slightly, pulling her arms around herself. Not cold, just human despite everything. Doran hesitated. Then, almost without thinking, he shrugged off his outer jacket and tossed it toward her. She caught it, blinking in surprise. Don't want you freezing to death before I figure out what to do with you, he muttered. She watched him for a moment, then smirked. See? You do have a heart, executioner. Doran didn't respond, because for the first time he wasn't sure that was a good thing. The fire crackled between them, throwing flickering light against the jagged rocks surrounding their makeshift shelter. Outside, the wind howled through the barren landscape, a cold and hollow sound that reminded Doran just how alone they were on this forsaken planet. It had been hours since they crashed, and exhaustion was finally catching up to him. He sat with his back against the stone, his rifle resting across his lap, his body aching from injuries he had no time to tend to. Across from him, Valeth lounged with an ease that irritated him. She had discarded his jacket, unbothered by the cold, by the wreckage, by everything. Her long black hair cascaded over her shoulders, silver eyes reflecting the fire's glow. You keep staring, executioner, she murmured. Starting to think you enjoy my company. Doran exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. I keep staring because I still haven't figured out if I made a mistake letting you live. She smirked. You did, but not for the reason you think. There was again that quiet, knowing confidence that got under his skin. She acted like she had already seen how this would play out, like she knew something he didn't. And maybe she did. Doran didn't trust her. He couldn't. But the problem was, part of him wanted to. The silence between them stretched long enough that Doran thought she had dozed off. Then, softly, she said, "They called you the Butcher of Orion 3. His jaw tightened. They did. Valeth watched him carefully. Why? He had heard the question before. From soldiers. From commanders. From ghosts in his dreams. He never answered. But this time, maybe it was the exhaustion or the fact that they were alone on a dying planet with no clear future. But he let himself speak. There was a battle. Orion 3 was an occupied colony, he said quietly. My orders were to neutralize the Zyri forces, cut off their supply chain, starve them out until they surrendered. She said nothing, just listening. He forced himself to continue. But they didn't surrender. They held the line. Longer than we expected. Longer than they should have been able to. A muscle in his jaw twitched. When we finally broke through, we realized why they'd fought so hard. He exhaled, shaking his head. They weren't protecting their forces. They were protecting civilians. Their families. And he cut himself off. A long, heavy silence. Then Valeth spoke. And you followed orders. Doran looked at her, waiting for judgment. It didn't come. She just studied him, quiet, unreadable. Then, she nodded once. I've seen men who enjoy killing Doran. You're not one of them. Something in his chest tightened at the way she said his name. He wasn't sure why. You don't know me, he muttered. She tilted her head, considering him. Maybe not, but I recognize regret when I see it. Doran exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He had expected more from her, mockery, indifference, maybe even disgust. But not this. Not quiet understanding. Not from her. He shifted, the movement sending a sharp pain through his ribs. He gritted his teeth. Valeth noticed. You're hurt. I'm fine. She arched a brow. You're an idiot. Before he could protest, she was already moving. Too fast. Too close. One moment, she was sitting across the fire, and the next she was kneeling beside him, fingers curling around the hem of his shirt. He caught her wrist before she could pull it up. What the hell are you doing? Checking your injury, she said, tone perfectly even. Unless you'd rather bleed out in silence. Doran scowled, but his grip loosened. She pulled up his shirt, revealing the bruises along his ribs. Ugly, deep, spreading in a way that made it clear he wasn't walking away from this without a few cracked bones. Her fingers skimmed lightly over the damage. Not enough to hurt, just enough to feel. Doran's breath hitched before he could stop it. She glanced up at him. Relax, executioner. I'm not trying to kill you. He didn't relax. Her touch was warmer than he expected. Too warm, more than human. She pressed her palm against his ribs, and he felt a faint, tingling heat spread beneath her fingers. Not painful, not unnatural, just odd. He inhaled sharply. What the hell? Accelerated healing, she murmured. Not much, just enough to keep you from getting worse. Doran's mind screamed at him to pull away, to not let her do this. But his body stayed still, and for the first time since they had landed, the cold stopped biting at his skin. She didn't move away when she was done, and neither did he. They were too close now. He could see every detail of her face. The sharp angles softened by firelight, the silver of her irises almost too bright, too knowing. She was too much. You're still staring, she whispered. Doran swallowed. So are you. Something shifted between them. Something heavier than words, more dangerous than weapons. It was one step too far, one step toward a line they weren't supposed to cross. And yet, neither of them pulled back. Valeth's fingers brushed lightly against his side, not healing this time. Just touching. Just there. Doran's breath came slower, deeper. You hesitate, she murmured. You hesitate with me in a way you don't with anyone else. His pulse pounded. That's not true. She smiled. Not mocking, not teasing, just knowing. Liar. He should have stopped this. He should have pushed her away, Should have put up the walls he had spent his whole damn life keeping intact. But he didn't. Instead, he reached out. His fingers brushed against her wrist, trailing up, pressing against the inside of her palm. A touch. Small. Barely there, but undeniable. Her breath caught. Then she leaned in. Not a kiss. Not yet. Just closer. Just enough that he could feel her warmth, could hear the faintest hitch in her breathing. Dorian exhaled slowly. This is a mistake. Valeth's voice was barely above a whisper. Probably. Neither of them moved away, because in that moment, against all logic, against every reason, against the war that had put them on opposite sides, they didn't want to. The fire had burned down to embers. Dorian sat against the cold rock wall of their makeshift shelter, staring into the dying glow, his mind heavy with the weight of what had happened between them. A touch. A moment. A mistake. Valeth was silent too, sitting across from him, her silver eyes unreadable. She hadn't spoken about what had happened, hadn't teased him for it, hadn't acknowledged the way their hands had lingered, the way neither of them had pulled away. Maybe that was worse, because it meant it wasn't just him thinking about it. The wind outside howled through the craggy terrain, carrying with it the promise of a storm. They were running out of time. No food, no water, no plan. They needed to move, and yet something held them in place. Or maybe someone. Then the comm device on his wrist crackled to life. Dorian sat up fast, pulse spiking. That was impossible. The pod's transmission system had been fried in the crash. The static sharpened then. Dorian Voss. This is Commander Rains of the Terran fleet. Stand down immediately. His blood turned to ice. The transmission was clear. Strong. That meant a Terran warship was close. Shit, he muttered under his breath. Valeth was already on her feet, her body tense. Your people, she said, voice unreadable. They found you. No, they weren't here for him. They were here for her. Dorian swallowed hard, pressing the comm to his lips. This is Captain Voss. How the hell did you track me? You activated an emergency transponder when you set course for Drask 5, Rains replied. Took us a while to get a signal, but we've been looking for you since your ship went down. Dorian closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Of course. He had triggered an automatic distress beacon without thinking. And now, they were both in danger. Commander, he said carefully. My mission was compromised. Save it, Voss, Rains snapped. We have orders. You were sent to execute the Zairi war criminal, not flee with her. So I'll ask you once, confirm the kill. Dorian's stomach twisted. His hand hovered over his sidearm. He could feel Valeth's eyes on him, waiting. Voss, Rains barked. Tell me she's dead. Silence. Too long. Then, Rains sighed. And Dorian knew what was coming before the words even left his mouth. Target is alive, Rains said coldly. Execute both of them. The sky split open. A deafening roar filled the air as drop ships descended through the clouds, their engines lighting up the barren landscape. Dust and debris spiraled into the air. Dorian reacted instinctively. He grabbed his rifle and turned to Valeth. Her claws were already unsheathed, her stance coiled like a predator preparing to strike. You knew this was coming, she murmured. No, he said, and it was the truth. But I should have. The first blast hit the ground near them, sending a shockwave through the rock formations. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Then the gunfire started. Dorian shoved Valeth behind cover just as bullets rained down from the drop ships above. Terran soldiers were already moving in, armored figures cutting through the dust, their rifles trained on him just as much as on her. Captain Voss, one of them called out. Surrender now. Dorian gritted his teeth, gripping his weapon. His own men, his own people. He had been loyal. He had followed orders. He had done everything they had ever asked of him, and still they had chosen to kill him. Valeth pressed close beside him, her breath warm against his ear. You hesitated before, she said quietly. Are you hesitating now? Dorian turned to look at her. Her silver eyes weren't mocking him this time. She was giving him a choice, a real one, and somehow the answer was easier than it should have been. Dorian cocked his rifle. Stay close. Then he opened fire. The battle was chaos. Doran moved on instinct, taking down 2 soldiers before they had the chance to react. Their armor was strong, but they hadn't expected him to turn on them. That gave him the edge. Valeth, meanwhile, was something else entirely. She vanished into the shadows, moving faster than his eyes could track. 1 second she was beside him, and the next, a Terran soldier screamed as she tore through his armor like it was paper, claws cutting deep into flesh. She fought like she had been made for this. And maybe she had. Doran ducked behind cover, reloading. His breath came fast, adrenaline surging through his veins. He had spent his entire life fighting for them, for the Terran military, for orders he never questioned. Now, for the first time, he was fighting against them, and it didn't feel wrong. Valeth landed beside him, breathing hard, blood splattered across her skin. Not her own. She didn't bleed easily. "We won't last like this," she said. "They'll keep sending more." Doran knew she was right. A low hum filled the air, the sound of a warship preparing to fire. His former allies were about to wipe them both off the face of this planet. "Run," he said, grabbing Valeth's arm and yanking her toward the wreckage of their escape pod. "Now!" They moved fast, sprinting over uneven terrain as the ship's turrets locked onto their position. Then, fire rained from the sky. They barely made it to cover before the bombs hit. The explosion was deafening, heat rushing past them as metal and stone were torn apart. Doran hit the ground hard, rolling onto his side. His ears were ringing, his vision blurred from the force of the blast. He turned to look for Valeth. She was already on her feet, pulling him up before he could fully register what had happened. "We need a ship," she said. "Now!" Doran's mind raced. There had to be something nearby, an outpost, a wreck, anything. Then he saw it, a Terran dropship, still intact from the landing. It was their only chance, but it meant getting through the remaining soldiers. Doran turned to Valeth, and for the first time since they met, he didn't see her as a prisoner or a threat or even an enemy. He saw her as the only damn person in the galaxy he could trust. "We take that ship," he said. Valeth's lips curved into a feral smile. "Now you're speaking my language." They locked eyes. Then, together they charged. The desert winds howled through the wreckage of the battlefield, kicking up dust and smoke as Doran and Valeth ran for their lives. The dropship loomed ahead, a Terran model, sleek and military-grade, its engines still warm from deployment. It was their only way off this planet. Behind them, the Terran forces regrouped. Orders were being shouted. Rifles were being raised. They had seconds, maybe less. Doran's breath burned in his lungs as he sprinted across uneven terrain. Valeth moved beside him, her form a blur of deadly grace, leaping over fallen debris as if she weighed nothing at all. The shipside hatch was still open. Doran didn't slow. He threw himself inside, pivoting immediately to cover their retreat. He raised his rifle, firing controlled bursts into the approaching soldiers. A few went down, but more kept coming. Then Valeth was there, her claws flashing in the dim light. She vaulted onto the nearest soldier, tearing through his armor like paper. He screamed, blood spraying across the metal floor. Doran barely had time to register the kill before she was moving again, snapping another soldier's neck with a brutal efficiency that sent a shiver down his spine. She was terrifying and beautiful. "Focus, Voss. Inside." "Now," he barked. Valeth spun, her silver eyes locking onto his. Then she jumped. He caught her wrist, yanking her inside as the ship's auto sensors detected movement and slammed the hatch shut behind them. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but ragged breathing, adrenaline, and the distant sound of gunfire hitting the hull. Then Doran moved. He scrambled into the cockpit, throwing himself into the pilot's seat. His fingers flew over the controls, overriding security systems, bypassing authorization locks. Red warning lights flashed across the interface, screaming at him that this ship did not belong to him. It did now. "Can you fly this thing?" Valeth called from behind him. Doran gritted his teeth, forcing the engines to power up. "We're about to find out." The ship trembled, systems coming online just as the Terran warship overhead adjusted its trajectory. Doran didn't need to check the scanners to know what was coming. Orbital strike. Hold on, he shouted. The thrusters kicked to life. The ship lurched upward, engines roaring as it tore from the surface of Drask, 5 in a cloud of fire and smoke. Then, impact. The warship fired. A pulse cannon blast grazed the hull, sending them spinning violently. Doran fought the controls, knuckles white, heart hammering. Shields failing, Valeth warned. Yeah, I noticed. Doran snapped. Another hit, and they'd be vaporized. His mind raced, scanning for options. Then he saw it. A debris field just beyond the planet's orbit, remnants of an old battle. If they could make it there, they could lose the warship in the wreckage. Doran angled the ship hard, forcing the thrusters to full burn. The G-force pressed him into his seat, but he didn't let up. Come on, you bastard, he muttered under his breath. The warship loomed behind them, its turrets locking on. Then they hit the debris field. Doran weaved through the wreckage, dodging massive chunks of twisted metal, burned-out husks of old ships. The Terran warship hesitated. One wrong move, and they'd collide with their own past destruction. It was just enough. Doran threw the ship into a sharp dive, pushing past the last piece of wreckage before slamming into hyperspace. The stars stretched and twisted, and then, suddenly, there was silence. They were free. Doran exhaled slowly, his hands still locked around the controls, his body still wired for combat. His heart was hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. Behind him, Valeth let out a slow breath. Well, that was fun. Doran turned in his seat, leveling her with a glare. You and I have very different definitions of fun. She smirked. You're just mad because you thought we were going to die. We almost did, but we didn't. Doran shook his head, running a hand through his hair. The tension in his muscles was still coiled tight, adrenaline still thrumming through him. Then he looked at her, really looked at her. She was leaning against the bulkhead, arms crossed, watching him the same way she always did, like she knew something he didn't. Something inside him gave way. He stood, crossing the small space between them before he could think better of it. She didn't move, didn't flinch. She just watched him, waiting. He was tired of waiting. Doran reached out, fingers curling around the back of her neck, pulling her closer. Her breath hitched, just slightly, but she didn't stop him. Tell me this is a mistake, he muttered. Valeth's lips parted slightly. Her silver eyes were so close now, too bright, too much. It probably is, she whispered, but she didn't pull away. Neither did he. Doran closed the distance. The first touch of their lips was lightning. Not soft, not careful, desperate, reckless, inevitable. She pushed him back against the nearest wall, her hands gripping his shirt, his fingers tangling in her hair. She tasted like fire and danger, like every bad decision he had ever made. And he didn't care, because right now, with her in his arms and the entire galaxy burning behind them, there was nothing else that mattered. When they finally broke apart, their breathing was uneven, their bodies still pressed together. Valeth ran a thumb over his jaw, studying him. You're in deep now, executioner. Doran exhaled a quiet laugh, pressing his forehead against hers. Yeah, he admitted. I really am. Outside, the stars stretched endless before them. The Terrans wanted them dead. The Zyri would never stop hunting her. The galaxy would never accept what they had become. But none of that mattered, because for the first time in his life, Doran Voss wasn't running from something. He was fighting for something. The silence after battle was always the loudest. Doran sat in the pilot's chair, staring out at the endless stretch of stars. The ship hummed softly beneath his fingertips, its system stable, their escape successful. For now, he exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. They had done it. They had survived the Terran betrayal. They had outrun death. But the question still lingered, unspoken between them. What now? Behind him, Valeth moved. She was standing near the viewport, arms crossed, her silver eyes reflecting the light of distant galaxies. She hadn't said much since they'd jumped to hyperspace. Maybe she was thinking the same thing he was. Maybe she already had the answer. Doran leaned back in his seat. We can't run forever. Valith's lips curved slightly, but there was no humor in it. I've been running my whole life. Then maybe it's time to stop? She turned to look at him fully now. And do what, Doran? Find a nice, quiet planet and pretend the entire galaxy isn't trying to kill us. He shrugged. Could be nice. She huffed a soft laugh, but it was tired. He knew that feeling. The exhaustion that came after surviving what shouldn't have been survivable. For the first time in his life, Doran wasn't following orders. Wasn't bound by duty, by command chains, by rules carved into his bones since the day he became a soldier. And it was terrifying. But when he looked at her, the most dangerous woman in the galaxy, the one he was supposed to execute, the one he should have feared, all he felt was certainty. He stood, moving toward her, slowly, giving her the space to move away if she wanted to. She didn't. You're not alone anymore, Valith, he said quietly. You don't have to be. She stared at him, and for the first time since he had met her, he saw something crack in her expression. Not fear, not cold amusement, something real. She reached for him before he could process it, fingers curling around his wrist, her grip firm but not forceful. Just there, just anchoring herself to something that wasn't destruction or survival. Doran, she said, his name soft on her lips like she wasn't used to saying it. Like it meant something now. And maybe it did. Maybe it always had. We need a plan, he said, voice steadier than he felt. Somewhere safe. Valith raised a brow. There's no such thing for people like us. Doran smirked. Then we make one. Her grip on his wrist tightened, then relaxed. Not letting go. Where do we start? She asked. He lifted his free hand, tapping a few commands into the console. A new star map appeared, uncharted systems, far beyond Terran and Zyri space. The kind of places where ghosts went to disappear. He looked at her. Wherever the hell we want. For the first time in a long time, the future wasn't written for them. They would write it themselves, together. Valith smirked. Then let's get lost, executioner. Doran pulled her closer, his lips brushing against hers in a promise. A new beginning, a new war, a new life. And as their ship disappeared into the dark expanse of space, neither of them looked back.